The diplomatic flagship Merhull arrived in orbit 3 days ahead of schedule. To those in the know, this wasn't a gesture of goodwill, it was assertion. The Concorde had sent envoys before, but this deployment was different. No analysts, no cultural intermediaries, just 3 Scirethi diplomats, escorted by a bio-coded security cluster and shielded inside a hull that pulsed with passive neuro-emitters. They didn't descend to Earth expecting to negotiate. They came to perform what the Concorde called a compliance recalibration. On record, it was classified as a Class 3 mimetic engagement mission. Off record, it was a warning. Earth had triggered the Concorde's attention the moment it deployed a jump stabilizer over Titan's outer ring, built independently, without Concorde consultation, from fragments recovered in the eurythmic debris field. That stabilizer had functioned perfectly, too perfectly. Concorde doctrine mandated that any non-signatory species using entangled transit without escort was subject to remedial contact. The response came within a month, veiled as diplomacy, but backed with cultural enforcement rights buried under 100 years of Galactic Charter footnotes. But Earth didn't follow standard reception protocol. There was no arrival parade, no staged handshake at Geneva's Interstellar Council Hall, no flags, no press, no broadcasts. Instead, the Scirethi were routed to an airstrip outside the Kazakh exclusion zone. From there, a sealed transport descended into the permafrost, disappearing down a magnetic shaft too narrow for any surveillance drone to follow. The transport cabin was quiet, its Concorde-issued translation buffer buzzing softly in standby mode. The escorts didn't speak. The air grew colder as they dropped. The transport stopped 400 meters underground, releasing a hiss of pressure as its doors parted. The Scirethi stepped into silence, thick concrete walls, dim utilitarian lights, no welcoming committee. Just one man standing ahead beneath a reinforced arch, dressed in matte black field uniform with no visible rank insignia. His expression didn't change. He didn't blink more than once. This was not the face of a host. It was the face of a system doing its job. "Commander Halran Mirek," he said simply, voice clipped but steady. "Extraterritorial Strategic Bureau." The senior Scirethi envoy, Caltris Van, inclined his head, his neck ridges flaring slightly in what humans often mistook for politeness. "This is not the agreed-upon venue. Concorde Protocol designates planetary council structures as standard for Tier 3 diplomacy." "This site was cleared under Concorde Clause 12.3, Mirek said, already turning away. "Mimetic contact sites must be sovereignty sealed. Your mission profile qualifies. Follow me." The envoys exchanged a glance. Sharp, low-frequency pulses passed between them, unreadable to the naked eye, but heavy with doubt. Still, they followed. Their footfalls echoed in the corridor, the walls absorbing sound a beat too late, like an old predator relearning its gait. Zone T9 had once been a Cold War tribunal bunker, designed for prosecuting foreign agents in complete sensory isolation. Now it housed different secrets. Earth's Exo-Intelligence Directorate had hollowed it out and rebuilt from within. Behind the aging concrete was a lattice of quantum baffles, substrate scrubbers, and feedback null EM membranes. No signals escaped, none entered, and inside, truth itself could be framed as architecture. Mirek led them through an outer decontamination corridor, past retinal scanners and kinetic induction gates. The lights remained low, deliberately non-invasive. No flickering panels, no holographs, no ambient hum, just silence carved by control. The final chamber was a single hexagonal vault, one entrance, one exit. A triangular table at the center, its metal unmarked. 3 chairs for the Scirethi, 1 for Mirek. No screens, no ports, no visible surveillance. Caltris Van's escort paused. "There is no active uplink." "There won't be," Mirek replied. "This facility is sealed under the Sovereign Cognition Directive. Transmission protocols are suspended during substrate equal engagements." "That protocol is obsolete," the escort said more sharply now. "It was decommissioned for civilian diplomacy 12 cycles ago." Mirek stared at him. "This isn't civilian diplomacy." He took his seat at the lone chair. The lights in the vault dimmed further, calibrating for neurospectral safety. The Concorde envoys hesitated. Their vessel above had reported no signal interference, yet here nothing moved, no input from orbit, no contact relay. And by Concord doctrine, once a memetic interface began in a substrate equal site, the interaction had to run to full cycle. To leave prematurely without documented cognitive interference would be to acknowledge procedural breach, and that would be seen by their own hierarchy as weakness. They sat. No introductions, no formalities. Mirek tapped a recessed pad beneath the table. No sound, no light, but the simulation had begun. From above, within the Kuma hull, nothing changed. The vessel hung in Earth's orbit like a sleeping eye, its neuromembranes absorbing environmental stimuli. Inside the vault, however, reality had shifted. The walls remained static. The table remained inert. But into the minds of the Shirethi, a channel opened, legal, non-invasive, but absolute. Earth had activated what it called Red Frame Protocol, and according to Concord law, it had every right to do so. Caltris Van's first sensation was confusion, not pain, not intrusion, but the sensory equivalent of a historical blade pressed lightly against the skin of thought. Not sharp, not immediate, but ancient and true. The first images were disorienting, silent footage of human faces in old grainy light, children smiling before builders, ings marked with red crescents. Then the buildings disappeared. Ash, followed by footage of trenches filled with stagnant water and shivering soldiers. Verdun. The footage was real, unaltered, verified. The Concord knew it. Earth didn't fabricate its pain, it filed it, indexed it, and now presented it. More followed. Bombings without sound, screams without voices, still images with emotion tags embedded in neurocompatible format. A child in Biafra, skin stretched over ribs. A mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, clipped to a time-stamped pulse. Then, seconds later, footage of a gloved hand reaching for lunar soil, laughter through static as Apollo 11 touched down. The contradiction wasn't aesthetic, it was structured. Humanity's shame and brilliance threaded together, sequenced in a deliberate emotional algorithm. Not to attack, not to justify, to be seen. Mirek did not speak. He did not interrupt. The simulation was only in its earliest calibration phase. It would grow deeper. It would become recursive. But already, Caltris Van's gaze faltered. For the first time in decades of Concord negotiations, the envoy did not feel like a superior being instructing a younger species. He felt watched. Not by humans, by the weight of what they remembered. Caltris Van initiated the Confluence dialect precisely 40 seconds after seating protocol confirmed. His voice didn't rise or alter pitch. There were no vocalizations in the human sense. Instead, the Shirethi envoy's throat nodes shimmered with a subharmonic frequency, activating the shared neuroempathic field intended for compliant initiation. Designed over centuries, the dialect bypassed translation algorithms by embedding logic-weighted affect triggers directly into the auditory cortex. It was supposed to create the illusion of understanding without resistance. Most junior species accepted the conditioning without recognizing it as manipulation. Mirek didn't move. His pulse didn't rise. He made no attempt to mask the neural broadcast or interrupt it. He allowed it to land, allowed the Shirethi to believe they had the upper hand. What happened next wasn't a countermeasure. It was a sequence. Pre-approved, pre-constructed. Earth had never intended to block the dialect. They had designed Red Frame to absorb it. The walls did not pulse. The chamber did not react. But in the minds of the Shirethi envoys, the environment began to shift. The Confluence dialect depended on coherent emotional responses, structured empathy, predictability of cognitive feedback loops. It worked by guiding the subject toward acceptable moral interpretation. But Red Frame's design inverted that process. It didn't reject the dialect, it rerouted it through recursive human memory strata. The first layer was historical, static footage, time-stamped and cross-referenced with open-source verification codes readable by Concordian cognition. A schoolyard in Pripyat, children drawing suns on pavement 1 hour before Reactor 4 breached containment. A street in Sarajevo, silent before the first sniper shot, cracked open the siege. These were not presented as accusations. There was no narrator, no guiding hand. The images stood alone, each one braided with an emotional impulse tagged to the affective spectrum recognized by the Concorde. They were meant to bypass guilt and enter analysis, but the sheer density was overwhelming. Then came a shift, no longer linear. The Sirathi expected a chronological recounting, a digestible timeline of primitive trauma. Instead, Red Frame unfolded into non-linear recursion. Biafra followed Apollo. Challenger's debris cloud followed the ceasefire at Panmunjom. Verdun dissolved into the moment of first contact, humans extending a trembling hand across the void. The contradictions began to stack without resolution. There were no moral conclusions, no certainty of cause or effect. Mirik remained still, posture unaltered. He knew what they were experiencing. Red Frame had been tested against Earth's own diplomats in deep structure training drills. Few made it past the 40-minute mark without disorientation, but humans had spent generations metabolizing contradiction. Their civilizations were built on historical guilt, balanced by aspirational myth. The Sirathi had no such immunity. 17 minutes into the sequence, the youngest envoy, Threxel, adjusted his optic nodes. A shimmer passed over his facial dermal folds, an autonomic tell. His left hand trembled once, barely noticeable. A pulse of ultraviolet flicked across his skin, a subconscious attempt to ground his identity loop. Cultris Van leaned forward slightly, pressing his fingertips to the edge of the table. It was meant to be a gesture of command, but Mirik registered the pressure differential, a brace. He had seen it in human officers exposed to feedback dissonance during early mind loop interface trials, the body trying to anchor itself when the mind could not. The simulation moved deeper. An infant screaming behind shattered hospital glass during the Aleppo bombings, the soft click of boot heels on railway platforms in 1942. The moment the Earth saw itself from space for the first time. Earthrise 1968. The eyes of Neil Armstrong beneath his helmet, wide not with pride, but shock. The footage was raw. Nothing had been cleaned, filtered, or shaped for alien interpretation. It wasn't a show of horror. It was a show of what humans could hold inside themselves without breaking. 23 minutes in, Cultris Van's vitals shifted. Mirik noticed the skin coloration change first, traces of green fluorescence at the base of the throat, signaling feedback loop saturation. The Sirethi's auxiliary mind, an engineered cognitive parallel processor embedded within his parietal cortex, began to glitch. Instead of compressing the incoming information, it was rerouting, reflecting emotional input back into his primary neural stream. That wasn't supposed to happen. The Sirathi designed those minds to protect the envoy, to buffer trauma. But Red Frame wasn't trauma, it was contradiction. And contradiction, left unresolved, creates recursion. Cultris Van's breath caught, and he leaned back. His escorts turned to him, silent, concerned, but did not interrupt. The protocol wouldn't allow it. Threxel's fingertips tapped twice on the surface of the table, then stopped. The second envoy, Sarnet, whose face had remained unreadable, exhaled through compressed gill folds. Cultris Van looked directly at Mirik. His voice, when it emerged, sounded filtered, reduced in bandwidth, as though rotated through failing buffers. This protocol is destabilizing neural integrity. We request interface suspension. Mirik didn't look away. Clause 7.4 of the Post-Signatory Non-Duality Charter, Section 3b, engagements conducted on sovereignty-sealed substrate equal grounds must run to natural simulation cycle completion. No termination may occur without verifiable loss of continuity. Threxel's voice snapped up, sharper. We file formal protest under Cultural Preservation Clause. It's on record, Mirik replied evenly. Simulation continues. The Sirathi froze. Mirik knew they would reach this point. Earth's legal archivists had found Clause 7.4 buried in the Concorde's 1,000-page treaty index, a clause no one had used in over a century. Concorde assumed junior civilizations lacked the legal infrastructure to exploit it. Earth had built Red Frame specifically around that clause, constructing the simulation within the allowable parameters for cognitive substrate equality. They weren't breaking any rules, they were playing by the only ones that mattered. He watched as Caltris Van closed his eyes, not in defiance, but in concentration, trying to stabilize the loop. But the next sequence had already begun. A man with no legs crawling through the mud of Hue City, dragging another soldier under fire. Flash cut to a nuclear technician smiling at her daughter before entering Reactor 3 at Fukushima. Then the first Voyager signal, then Auschwitz, then Tiananmen, then the singing of monks as Notre Dame burned. The simulation offered no closure, no certainty, just the weight of everything humans remembered and still walked forward with. The Shirethi had come to condition Earth, but Earth had brought them into its memory instead, and memory, once seen, could not be undone. The second morning began with silence. Not the diplomatic stillness of mutual acknowledgement, but the kind that follows structural damage, when a system continues to function but no longer trusts its own inputs. Caltris Van remained seated longer than necessary at the nutritional intake station, his hands unmoving, gaze unfixed. The confluence dialect hadn't been reinitiated. His auxiliary mind, Tavrek, designed for parallel processing of high-intensity cognitive input, had not rebooted fully since the overload. The neural shimmer behind his pupils no longer maintained rhythm. The other envoys watched him carefully, but said nothing aloud. Commander Mirek entered the vault precisely at 0600 local time, same as before. No change in posture, no hint of triumph. He offered no new briefings, no commentary. He simply stood at his assigned position and waited, eyes scanning each of the three without judgment. Behind him, the red frame interface remained dormant. Its cycle paused but not terminated. The room felt colder. Caltris Van finally stood, not with purpose but with calculation. Each movement tested muscle tension. His words came slowly, each syllable weighed as if passed through an inner court. I am invoking a halt in cycle continuation based on emergent cognitive interference. This chamber is no longer suitable for integration. Mirek did not nod. Clause 7.4 remains binding. Emergent interference does not qualify as discontinuity unless primary identity structures collapse or undergo hostile inversion. Your auxiliary system is intact. We detect cross-effect bleed from human empathy strata, Threxil added. The auxiliary loop is registering non-originating sentiment, despair, shame, uncontextualized grief. This qualifies as hostile memetic terrain. Mirek's tone didn't shift. All simulation content conforms to Charter Article 12 standards, authentic, unedited, non-coercive. Sentiment exposure is emergent, not induced. If the auxiliary is unable to compartmentalize, it's a limitation of your architecture, not a violation of protocol. The tension sharpened. Sarnat stepped forward half a pace, his voice lower. We request orbital override. The Khmer hull holds mission override codes for cultural preservation. This facility is not aligned with mental integrity protections. It is, Mirek replied. Pre-clearance was granted by Concord's own arbitration office 3 weeks before your arrival. Earth's Council of Partition submitted full schematic transparency to the Treaty Commission. No objections were filed. They stared at him. None of them had known. Not because the Concorde had hidden it, but because they hadn't checked. Why would they? Earth was a probationary species. No culture under 2 centuries of galactic access had ever used legal symmetry to launch a cognitive assault. That kind of manipulation was the work of high-tier civilizational entities. Those who shaped Dr. Ines not survived under them. Mirek's next words were clinical. A concession is available. Tactile empathy nodes may be deactivated during the next segment. Physical resonance attenuation has been authorized by Red Frame administrators. Caltris Van's breath hitched. He understood what was being offered. Detachment from the experiential texture of the simulation. Emotion without sensation. The price of safety would be a compromise of fidelity. In Concord terms, this was a dilution of protocol purity, an admission that the dialect had failed to assert narrative dominance. "No," he said finally, "we proceed with full integration." Mirek gave a single, silent nod. The next cycle was cued. Later that evening, the vault was dark except for faint auxiliary illumination. The envoys rested in assigned containment quarters, walls bare and acoustically flat. There were no comfort matrices, no memory reinforcements, only standardized modules and medical access ports tuned to Concordian neural frequencies. Tavrek, the auxiliary cognitive processor embedded within Caltris Van, remained unresponsive in cycle redundancy mode. Then it happened. Without warning, the internal loop system began echoing data packets across unrelated neural fields. Redundancy filters failed. Emotional crosstalk surged. Tavrek collapsed into recursive trauma, a loop formed from real historical exposure, amplified by incomplete segmentation. It wasn't pain, not in the physical sense, it was containment failure. The mind within the mind was bleeding. Emergency overrides initialized, but the Concord's own failsafes triggered errors. Too foreign, too nonlinear. Protocol decay accelerated. Threxel activated the emergency assistance beacon coded to override substrate errors. Mirek didn't hesitate. He authorized AI Janva 9, Earth's embedded oversight system, to intervene. Janva 9 ran a Concord-certified Integris IT schema, archived and reconstructed through deep-dive acquisitions from a decommissioned diplomatic relay 3 years prior. Legally grey, functionally perfect. Within 90 seconds, Tavrek stabilized. Feedback collapsed to baseline. Crosstalk ceased. None of the envoys spoke. None acknowledged what had just occurred, but the silence said everything. Earth had used a Concord algorithm to save a Concord mind from Earth's own simulation. The irony wasn't subtle. Caltris Van didn't sleep that night. He sat in his containment module, watching the static pulses of his auxiliary feed reflect across the wall. The Concord had arrived expecting to discipline a primitive. They had found something else, not rebellion, not defiance. Competence. Every word, every clause, every interface cycle had been law-bound. There had been no violation, no breach, and that was the problem. Earth hadn't broken the rules. They had perfected them. The simulation chamber hadn't been retrofitted. It had been built from the beginning for this kind of encounter. The EM shielding, the isolation vault, the legal redundancies hard-coded into the walls, all of it had been designed not to protect Earth, but to force the Concord to abide by its own codes under conditions it had never imagined. Caltris Van realized the trap too late. They weren't here to win, they were here to complete the simulation. Clause 7.4 wasn't a shield, it was a cage, and the door had shut the moment they sat down. Caltris Van entered the vault with less certainty than before. His steps were measured, but not anchored. Behind him, Threxil and Sarnet followed in silence, both aware that whatever definition of protocol had once governed this mission no longer offered protection. Their internal alignment was fraying. Tavrek, the auxiliary loop, remained functional, but now required active regulation. None of them dared suggest returning to orbit. That discussion was dead. What remained was survival, not in the biological sense, but the ideological. They were no longer attempting to steer the encounter. They were bracing against it. Commander Mirek stood waiting, same position, same expression, as if the days prior hadn't happened. His posture radiated no superiority. It didn't need to. Everything had already been said without words. Red Frame had torn at their periphery, not through aggression, but by confronting them with the unfiltered density of human memory. Now the Sirethi were fragmented, not defeated but destabilized. And yet, something deeper waited beneath the surface. Caltris Van could feel it. The simulation hadn't ended. It had only been setting the stage. "We file formal request for termination," Caltris Van said, voice stripped of ceremony. "This facility is no longer aligned with cognitive parity. We are recording neural saturation exceeding all previous diplomatic thresholds." Mirek didn't blink. "Request noted. Denied under Earth's emergency sovereignty clause. Silence. Then a sound. Not sharp, not mechanical. A low-frequency shift in the vault's base signature. Subtle, but felt in the bones. The walls did not light, the table did not change, but something behind the structure of the room opened. A shift, not in architecture, but in paradigm. Mirror protocol, Mirek said. The words fell like a sentence, not a command. The air didn't grow colder, but reality did. The simulation did not resume where Red Frame had left off. There were no images of Earth, no footage, no pain, no triumph. Instead, Caltris Van found himself standing, somewhere else, a corridor of light, soft-edged structures that reflected endlessly into impossible geometries. He recognized the Concorde's colors, the architectural grace of their core delegations. But everything was wrong. The proportions were distorted, not visually, ethically. The light changed depending on where he looked, opinions reshaping angles. The walls spoke in contradictions. One corridor told him authority was stability. The next said authority must justify itself each day anew. A platform hovered above what resembled a Concorde tribunal chamber. Except the figures on the dais were not Shirethi. They were humans, or simulations of them, rendered not in flesh, but in principle. A woman with no eyes passed judgment by remaining silent. A child delivered verdicts by laughing. An old man erased laws by remembering his failures. It was not chaos. It was worse. It was autonomy, without guarantee. Caltris Van tried to speak, but found no syntax. His words became questions before they left his mind. That was when he understood. This was not a human environment. This was the Concorde itself, rebuilt from the ground up as if humans had created it. The simulation was absolute. The doctrines had changed. Empathy was optional. Consensus was an artifact, not a goal. Purity of belief was treated as a form of cultural death. The very laws of the Concorde had been rewritten into recursive debate structures. Justice was determined by argument durability, not agreement. Harmony was neither enforced nor revered. It was suspicious. Threxil appeared beside him, staggering slightly. "This isn't historical," he whispered, but the sound echoed into a dozen meanings. "This is us." Sarnet was no longer with them. Caltris Van moved through a corridor that resembled the Concorde's central data vault on Kedrix Prime. It had once stored millennia of mimetic consensus records. Now the walls were lined with Freudian fragments, shattered principles, partial doctrines, splinter manifestos, each vying for recognition. The simulation offered no preference. It allowed them all to exist simultaneously. Then, projected across a transparent partition, he saw himself. His own diplomatic address from the previous century, the one that had formalized Concorde's rejection of emotion-driven species. But the speech had been altered, not falsified, recontextualized. Each phrase layered with opposing human values. Where he had said, "Truth is that which remains after consensus," the simulated version echoed back, "Truth is that which survives contradiction." Caltris Van recoiled. The statement meant nothing to him. And yet, it held, it persisted. Even now, he could not unthink it. In the next chamber, Threxil collapsed. His mental architecture had begun looping, attempting to resolve a recursive ethical paradox embedded in one of the simulation's reflections. His cortical stack tried to decide whether non-consensual autonomy was better than enforced peace. But the question had no correct answer. The loop couldn't close. Janva 9, still monitoring from Earth systems, intervened, again using Concorde protocols. Neural stabilizers engaged. But this time the damage was partial. Threxil didn't wake. Caltris Van stood alone before the final segment. A simulated Concorde assembly, identical in shape, filled with Shirethi envoys, except their voices were fractured, half-spoken logic, the others in contradiction. None could understand each other. Then from above a single construct descended, a simple symbol, a split mirror, half black, half silver, floating in silence. The simulation whispered in the original Concord root tongue, a language so old it was now only used in archival rituals. If humans were Concord, would you still exist? Caltris Van staggered backward. He knew the answer. And he couldn't say it. Yet the simulation ended. He returned to the vault floor with a jolt. Cold sweat clung to his skin. His breathing came in shallow pulses. Threxil was still unconscious. Sarnet had withdrawn into mental silence, locked in stabilization. Mirek hadn't moved. He waited, not as a host, not even as a victor, simply as a man doing his job. Caltris Van couldn't speak. He simply stared at the floor. The world humans had shown them wasn't alien. It was a mirror, turned inward, not outward, not an attack on their history, but a question about their future. And that was what made it lethal. The vault was colder on the final day, though no one adjusted the environmental controls. The shift came not from temperature, but absence. The kind of cold that settles after something breaks. Not loudly, not visibly, but all the same. Threxil remained seated near the wall, his eyes unfocused, mind intact only by grace of stabilizer threading. Sarnet hadn't spoken in hours, caught somewhere between sentience and deep meditative stasis. Caltris Van stood, though it looked more like balancing than command. His back was straighter than before, but his shoulders held the stillness of exhaustion that wasn't physical. There were no questions left to ask, and no further truths to demand. Whatever the purpose of their mission had been at the start, it had evaporated in the gravity of the mirror protocol. They had come to assert boundaries. Instead, they had found the edges of their own minds. The airlock hissed once, not a mechanical malfunction but an alert. It was subtle, just a shift in pressure and a small light above the vault's reinforced access gate turning from blue to amber. A procedural signal, nothing more. But Caltris Van knew what it meant. The Q-Merhull had terminated its tether. No signal, no reply. The Concorde's flagship had cut transmission, disabling its override sync with the surface team. The orbiting Vess, once their safety net, their silent authority, was gone, not in distance, but in decision. There would be no extraction, no override orders, no escalation. They were alone. Caltris Van didn't speak. He turned his head slightly, enough to register the others, but not enough to address them. They were past deliberation. The Concorde had chosen silence as its statement. It hadn't ordered retreat or issued reprisal. It had simply severed the channel, an institutional gesture that said, "We did not predict this. We cannot control it. Proceed without us." Commander Mirek entered 5 minutes later, as punctual as ever. His uniform was unchanged, his face unreadable. If he felt satisfaction, it didn't show. If he considered what had happened a victory, he gave no indication. He walked to the center of the chamber, placed a single object on the table, and stepped back. It was not a device. It was a printed document. Actual paper, pressed, unadorned, folded in half along a central line. Caltris Van stepped forward slowly, as if compelled by ritual rather than intent. He didn't touch the document. He looked at it like it might detonate. Mirek finally spoke. Treaty of Parallel Development and Non-Inference. His voice was neither cold nor warm. It was simply done. One clause, he said. Earth agrees never to engage in Concordian space or interfere with its internal treaties, legal systems, or civilizational trajectory. In exchange, the Concorde agrees never to impose any restriction, cognitive, mimetic, cultural, or legal, on the development of human ideological structures or neurological architecture. Caltris Van said nothing. He didn't need to. The offer was not a negotiation. It was a release valve. There would be no signatures, no ceremonial documentation, not even a biometric scan. The Concorde had protocols for handling informal contacts between species too alien to understand each other fully. Earth had found a way to become one of them, not by mutation, but by understanding so deeply that Concord Protocol collapsed under its own weight. Caltris Van looked at the object on the table again. In Concord tradition, a treaty meant consensus, a shared platform, mutual values. But what lay before him wasn't a handshake. It was a boundary line drawn with surgical precision. Not a truce. A firewall. He turned back to Mirek. No anger, no protest. Only this. Will it be archived? Mirek met his eyes. It already is. Caltris Van nodded once. Slow. Final. The camera in the chamber, a single spherical eye embedded in the ceiling, long dormant, came online with a soft blink of red. Mirek gestured toward it. This recording marks the end of simulation phase and initiation of open withdrawal under full observational transparency. No retaliation will follow. No counter-narrative will be distributed. You will return without accusation. Earth will file no claim. Caltris Van approached the table. He did not touch the paper. He did not speak into the camera. He simply stood there, long enough for silence to become record. Then he turned away. The doors unlocked. No alarms, no lockdown sequence. The vault simply opened, as if none of it had ever happened. The transport waited above in the access shaft, unchanged. The envoys entered it in silence. No staff guided them, no soldiers watched. Just the three of them, one shattered, one frozen, one still standing. The ascent through the shaft took 17 minutes. Outside the atmosphere, the Q-Merhal re-established connection the moment the EM field faded. The docking port extended automatically. The ship did not greet them. There was nan en bisos, acknowledgement. The vessel simply opened its intake. The diplomats entered. No final transmission was logged, no summary file uploaded. The Q-Merhal left orbit on a low-emission trajectory. There was no fanfare, no message, no threat. Earth did not fire on it. Earth did not follow. The ship vanished into deep trajectory curve, engines whispering through the vacuum. Commander Mirek remained in the vault for another 10 minutes after the withdrawal. The paper remained untouched. He made no note, gave no debrief. Only after the vault lights dimmed to standby did he finally turn toward the internal exit corridor, hands still at his sides. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to say. 11 weeks passed without a sound. No requests, no replies, not even a demand for clarification. The vacuum after the Concordian delegation's withdrawal was deliberate, strategically constructed silence. When the packet finally arrived, it wasn't delivered through a standard diplomatic stream. It came encoded through a non-binding channel reserved for dead treaty clauses. The header bore no salutation, no symbols of reconciliation, only the classification code burned into its data frame. Level 5 refusal. The contents were clinical, no accusations, no elaborations. Earth had not violated Concord law. They had not deployed kinetic force. No deaths had occurred. The simulation had completed without breach. And yet, the decision was absolute. Earth would receive no further manned diplomatic engagement. No Concordian envoys, observers, archivists, or analysts would be authorized to step onto Terran soil or into Terran orbit for the foreseeable epoch. In Concord's central database, Earth's status was amended. It no longer held the designation of provisional peer species. It was now marked with a rare and largely symbolic annotation, psycho-singularity adjacent. The term didn't denote madness or instability. It was far more precise. It meant a culture capable of cognitively weaponizing contradiction, memory, and reflection so deeply that interaction became self-consuming for the engaging party. It meant Earth understood not only its own history, but had developed frameworks capable of collapsing external epistemology without laying a hand on it. It meant that the Concord, for all its millennia of mimetic architecture, had encountered something it could not standardize. Red frame was sealed under directive parallax break. The chamber at Zone T9 was depowered, the vault inert, the neural corridors deactivated. The simulation matrices were archived, encrypted, and disaggregated across secure black sites beneath the Antarctic ice core treaty zone. Only 3 human analysts were permitted to retain full session access. Commander Halloran Mirek was not one of them. His reassignment came without ceremony. A message, a location, Europa, inner core analytics beneath the glacial layer 5 fault line. No promotion, no disciplinary notation, just relocation. He left without protest. Europa suited him. There was no sky, no distractions, just silence and data, thousands of meters down beneath frozen oceans that had never known sunlight. There, Red Frame was tested again, not on adversaries, not on diplomats, but on reflection nodes, auto-tested mirror queries, controlled recursion loops, not for war, not for offense, for understanding. Because what the Concorde never realized, what they couldn't see behind the fear, was that Red Frame had never been designed to break them. It had been designed to hold a mirror to Earth first. Humanity had long known it was unstable. The centuries of war, betrayal, ambition, atrocity, all of it encoded into their memory. Red Frame had simply given it structure, and then asked, could anyone else bear it? Concorde could not, and so Earth adapted. The Council of Partition rewrote Earth's seek, or engagement doctrine. No longer would cognition be treated as mere interface. It was territory, and territory had borders, sovereign rules, and defensive strategies. Empathy became a top-layer protocol, no longer a given. Strategic pluralism was ratified as a recognized form of cognitive asymmetry. Diplomats were retrained, not to charm or compromise, but to measure ideological mass. Every future engagement would begin with a single question. What do they fear to remember? The Concorde adapted too. Within 5 cycles, a formal clause was introduced into their interstellar diplomacy charter. Cultures exhibiting full-spectrum cognitive recursion structures shall not be approached through manned protocol. It was a protective measure, not for war, for containment. But the damage had already leaked. In alien academies, think tanks, and neural alignment institutes, stories began to circulate. No official files were shared, but instructors whispered warnings. Cadets rehearsed simulations that ended in feedback collapse. Some called it myth, others a necessary caution. One phrase emerged. Never negotiate with a species that weaponizes its own trauma. It was repeated in classrooms, echoed in closed-door briefings, not out of fear, out of respect. Because the lesson was not just about humans, it was about fragility, about the cost of forgetting that memory, when unshielded, is not a story. It's a weapon. Beneath Europa's ice, Red Frame flickered again. There were no visitors, no missions, only a chamber, sealed in cryogenic stillness, waiting, not to attack, but to ask the next question.